Welcome everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old justice-seeking, faith-based policy and organizing network. And our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We're so excited to be continuing to co-host the series of webinars with our amazing partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. I'm joining this call from Detroit, Michigan, where the people of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Adobwa, and Potawatomi lived in relationship with the land. We acknowledge this land, its history, and all the beings seen and unseen, known and unknown, as we step into our work on this land and the many lands that you all are joining from, most of us as uninvited guests. And we offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this land. And we ask that if you would like to acknowledge the land of where you are currently, please put that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. You can find that at both the MFSA website and the UMKR website, and also on our YouTube channels. As you have questions, you don't have to wait till our Q&A time. You can go ahead and type them in the chat. We are collecting them, and we will have that for the Q&A section. And you can direct those questions to myself. I show up as Methodist Federation for Social Action, or to Teresa. And closed captioning is automatically generated, so do expect to see some spelling errors and other errors. Now, our moderator today is Pat Miner, a member of UMKR's steering committee and an experienced political advocate. Pat will moderate this webinar and later will share her experience in the practicing of bird dogging candidates. Pat holds a BA in psychology from the University of Iowa and has been advocating for Palestinian rights since she returned from her first trip to the region in 2005. She's an organizer in Iowans for Palestine, a political advocacy group that works to educate legislators, candidates, and voters about Palestinian rights. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Bridget. I just need to make one correction. I'm sorry. I have a BS in psychology, and I know that's a little ironic to say, but that's the way it is. So I want to also welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time this Wednesday at noon to be part of this webinar. UMKR is a movement for Palestinian human rights whose goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. To achieve that goal, United Methodist clergy and laity engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education to help our church and society understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their liberation struggle. As Christians, the advocates in UMKR believe that God has called us all to justice-seeking, peacemaking work. Today, we'll be talking about how to influence our legislators. They need to hear from us, especially on issues around Palestine. We have important stories, experiences, and requests to share with them. We have two speakers with us today who will help us learn first how to schedule meetings, how to prepare for them, and how to follow up. Then we'll dive deeper into current requests we can put on our list of asks around Palestine and Israel. First, we welcome Amy Hong, the Special Education Executive Director, the Special Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the United Methodist General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. As the director of the seminar program, Amy designs seminars on issues of justice and peace that include visits to legislative offices. Growing up in the church, Amy has had a lifelong interest in the intersection of personal faith and social justice, but felt the church was silent on how to engage in social justice. Since her graduation from Candler School of Theology, Emory University, and before coming to GBCS, Amy served as a local pastor and an education director where she actively incorporated justice and peace into faith formation and curriculum. When Amy is finished, Amy?
Thank you, Pat. And good afternoon. First, want to say thank you to UMKR and to MFSA for this opportunity to be with you all today. My purpose for today is to provide how to meet with your legislators, while Kyle will be providing the specific ask for your meetings. So let me share my screen with you all as we start my portion of the presentation. Great. Meeting with your legislators is just one of the many ways of participating in civic engagement. And as Christians, we have a tradition of putting faith into action. And as United Methodists, our understanding of social holiness compels us to transform relationships and systems for the pursuit of justice and peace. And one way that we can do this is by having a relationship with our legislators. Our United Methodist Book of Resolutions state the attempt to influence the information and execution of public policy at all levels of government is often the most effective means available to churches to keep before humanity the ideal of a society in which power and order are made to serve the ends of justice and freedom for all people. The Congressional Management Foundation conducted a survey of 260 congressional offices in both the House and the Senate, and they were asked this question: if your member, senator, has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And as you can see from the graph, in-person visits from constituents are most effective compared to the other ways of engaging, like form email messages and a visit from a lobbyist. Another question that they asked in the survey was, in your opinion, how important are the following for understanding constituents' views and opinions? And here, like the previous answer, attending events in the district, state ranks very high in legislators' understanding of constituents' views and opinions. Now, you might have noticed that the survey is from 2012, and the political landscape today feels and is very different, and that it might discourage us from reaching out to our legislators. However, last week, the Congressional Management Foundation and Partnership for Public Service released the State of the Congress 2022, and I want to share with you two of their findings. One, polarization and rhetoric are making it more difficult to get things done in Congress. This is probably not that surprising to you all. But the second one that I want to point for a conversation is that members, being the legislators' primary role is solving constituents' problems. A supporting question for this statement was, please describe in 10 words or less what you consider to be Congress's primary purpose. And the responses received that you can see on the screen, a lot of them depends on hearing from constituents, hearing from you, your views, your opinions. So what does this tell us today? Yes, it's more difficult to get things done in Congress, but legislators know the value and importance of constituents' views and opinions. And that is why it's important that we engage with our legislators. I realize that today's group is a mix of people that have probably never visited legislators to those that are experienced and have their senators' phone numbers already in their phones, probably on speed dial, and might find the next section to be a bit repetitive, but I hope that it will still be beneficial. So how do we contact our legislator's office? A quick way to do this is to go to these links, and in the chat, the links that I mentioned during this presentation will be dropped, and so you'll be able to find all of them there. But this page will provide a list of your legislators and their information. The only thing you have to do is provide your address. And when you click on their names, it should direct you to their website. Now on the website, and this differs by legislators, you can find a fillable request form for a meeting or find an email address, usually to their scheduler, to request a meeting, or a phone number to call the office and to schedule a meeting. And when you request a meeting, remember to include your name, your address, the issue that you wish to discuss, dates and times that you are requesting. And after a few days, if you don't hear from them, send them a reminder email or give them a call. Be willing to be flexible and do not be disappointed if you get a meeting with a staff member. Consider them your ally in getting your concerns shared with your legislators. So great, now you have your meeting scheduled, and now is the time to spend some time learning about your legislator if you don't know them already. Find out what committees they are in, find out what their faith tradition may be and their background. And you can find all of this information on congress.gov or, of course, on their website. For those of you meeting with your legislators alone or in a group, the following outline can work for both situations. If you're meeting as a delegate, during the preparation stage, assign a person for each of the following. So introduction, your name, where you're from, the purpose of your visit. And this is also a really great opportunity for you to say thank you if you are already a supporter of, if they are already a supporter of the issue. If you are meeting as a delegate, introduce yourself as a group. Save the time that you have for the meeting on the stories and the asks. So the next part, is the story and the ask, right? If you're meeting as a group, I recommend having 3 stories and asks. Stories are powerful. More than numbers and facts, stories are able to convey why you care about the issue and the change that you seek. So Kyle will be sharing with you all the asks, but if you can connect the ask to a story, it will be even more powerful. A resource that I highly recommend to help write your story is from Marshall Gantz. He is a lecturer at Harvard and the author of Why David Sometimes Wins. He was very involved in the civil rights movement, was on staff for the United Farm Workers, trainer and organizer for political campaigns. He is credited with devising the grassroots organizing model for Obama's 2008 election. He took his experience and knowledge and teaches courses at Harvard on grassroots organizing and social movements. And one of the key components of what he teaches is the power of stories. So in the links that will be provided, if not already in the chat, there's actually a worksheet that he created that will help guide you to create your own story. The next part is the follow-up. Now, during the meeting, which will flow like a conversation, there may be moments when the staff or legislator that you are meeting with does not have an answer for your question. Now, this is an opportunity for you to ask them what and who is the best to follow up. And lastly, conclude your meeting with a thank you. Something that I highly recommend to help you keep your focus during the meeting is to write a verbatim. Write down word for word what you will say and take it with you to your meeting. And if you're meeting with a group, rehearse to get that muscle memory of how the meeting will go. Now, on the day of the meeting, if you're visiting in person, Allow plenty of time to locate the office, security checkpoint, and also consider traffic. Being late to a meeting is a bad start to a meeting. Be flexible. You might have been given 30 minutes for a meeting, but it might get cut to 10 minutes. I have had seminar groups come to DC to meet with their legislators, and sometimes their meetings end abruptly because the senator has an emergency meeting. Sometimes they're asked to accompany the legislator down the hall, continue the meeting in the hallway while they're going to the next meeting. Sometimes 30 minutes turns to an hour. So stay flexible. Stay focused and friendly. During your meeting, there can be side comments and questions that come up, which can distract from the issue at hand. But remember that you are at that meeting for a specific ask. Feel free to bring the conversation back to the topic. Now, after the meeting, if you are meeting in a group, debrief with your delegation. Write a note of thanks, restate your position, and follow up on unanswered questions. Remember that your meeting with your legislator is not just a one-time event. It shouldn't be. Have a relationship with your legislator or office staff. It is through relationships that we can have influence. One story, and I'll end with this. A group of college students from Ohio has been coming to DC for a seminar with me for the past 7 to 8 years. And the topic that they have been studying consistently for these 7 to 8 years has been human trafficking. And they would go and meet with their senators after every seminar, every year for the past 7 to 8 years. So much so that one of their senators, Rob Portman, started to work on legislation on human trafficking and gave a nod to this group for constantly reminding him of the issue and that people cared about this issue. So I am actually at the end of my presentation, and unfortunately I am unable to stay for the Q&A. But if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to contact me, and I'd love to be in conversation with you. So thank you again, and I'll pass it over to Pat.
Thank you, Amy. That was very helpful. We really appreciate your willingness, and Godspeed your way. Kyle Christophilo is a Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at Churches for Middle East Peace. He holds a BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from Messiah College and a Master of Divinity degree from Emory University's Candler School of Theology. That sounds familiar. Kyle was first introduced to Middle East advocacy work during a semester abroad in Cairo, Egypt. After graduating from college, he spent 10 months serving with the Mennonite Central Committee in Palestine at Bethlehem Bible College. Most recently, Kyle served as the program assistant for Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on Legislation, where he helped coordinate lobbying work on Middle East policy and trained grassroots advocates in how to lobby their congressional representatives. Kyle?
Thank you very much. And I don't have the ability to start my video. So if one of the people with that has that privilege, I'm happy to have my video if that can happen. But if not, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Pat, and thank you to UMKR and MFSA. I'm really honored to be with you all this afternoon.
Kyle, you should be able to turn your video on. Can you try again?
Great, yes, now it works. Thank you, appreciate that. So thank you again for having me, and really great to follow Amy. Her presentation was spot on, and I hope that will help as you prepare to think about meeting with your congressional offices. I'll say that right now, before I get into the bulk of my presentation, is a great time to be thinking about this, because soon congressional members will be back in states and districts, normally for all of August through right after Labor Day. They're back doing events in their districts. So August is really a great time for constituents to reach out. And meetings, I should just note also, are still happening via Zoom. A lot of them are now starting to happen in person, but if you are still not comfortable with that, or your congressional member is not offering that, Zoom remains an option. So just wanted to note that before I delve into my presentation. So as Pat mentioned, I lead government relations work at Churches for Middle East Peace. I was scrolling through and saw a lot of familiar names, but for those who may not be familiar, Churches for Middle East Peace is a coalition of 34 national Christian communions that include representatives from across the theological spectrum of US Christianity, so mainline Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, some evangelical groups, historic peace churches. And what unites them in our work is three particular policy areas that we work on, advocacy priorities that we work on. One being holistic peace building, one being humanitarian and economic concerns, and the last being human rights. A majority of our work does focus on Israel-Palestine, so that's the focus of our conversation today, but we're also engaged with other parts of the Middle East, including Egypt, Jordan, Yemen. Right now, the continued civil war that's occurring in Yemen, in some ways that the US Congress is trying to get our policy better situated there. So really glad again to be with you all today. Before I get to specific legislation, really right now there has been a lot of activity in Congress regarding Israel-Palestine. It hasn't gotten specifically to legislation over the past few months, so you might have missed it. So I just wanted to go over some of these issues because they are possibilities that you can use when you're meeting with congressional offices. So first, I'm sure many of you have heard of the impending demolition. Some of them have actually already begun, and displacement of over 1,000 Palestinians in Masafer Yatta. Over 500 of those are children. That was spurred by an Israeli Supreme Court ruling in May. There have been 3 congressional letters so far, one that got 83 signatures, one that got 80 signatures, and one that got 15 signatures, all calling on the Biden administration to prevent these demolitions and displacements from moving forward. The one that had 83 signatures was bicameral, meaning there were representatives as well as senators that were on it. The proposed E1 settlements, known as the Doomsday settlements, due to their location in the middle of the West Bank, east of Jerusalem, which would cut off Palestinians from Jerusalem and severely undermine the viability for a Palestinian state. There's been one recent congressional letter with 31 signatures. The settlements were scheduled to be advanced on July 18th, but they've been postponed for a few months. I will try to, after I'm done talking, put links to these letters because it would be good to check. Amy said earlier, thanking your member if they've taken an action. Perhaps they're not on the particular legislation that you're hoping they will join, but they might have signed one of these letters. And so that's something to thank them about. We also expect there will be a letter soon relating to the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations that were earlier designated as terrorist organizations, quote unquote, by the Israeli government. We expect there will be a congressional letter in the coming days in that area. And then there is also right in the news this visa waiver program. So the Biden administration has expressed interest in getting Israel enrolled in this program, which would allow Israelis to visit the US without visas for 90 days. But by law, that would require Israel to engage in non-discriminatory treatment of American citizens seeking to enter Israel. This would include Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian Americans who currently do not receive equal treatment when they seek to enter Israeli occupied territories. So there was a congressional letter in this regard as well. So again, I'll try to post the links, but just to know that even if we're not seeing necessarily new legislation that has been introduced over the past few months, Congress is definitely paying attention. And it's because folks like you are reaching out and making known that this is an issue that you care about. So I did just want to start with that. So now, as Amy said in her presentation, you want to come with an ask. And generally, it's best if that can be an ask related to specific legislation. So I'm quickly going to go through some legislation that's out there right now. It's going to be up to you and your group as to what you will want to raise. Generally, we would suggest really staying with one ask per meeting, just because the more asks you have, the harder it can be to track in a meeting. It's kind of easier to sort of obscure or forget because you have multiple things that you're bringing to their attention. So in general, it's a good idea to kind of come with one piece of legislation that you would like for them to support. So right now, the bill that really brings together a lot of what I just talked about before, the mistreatment of an eviction of Palestinians from Masafer Yatta, and of course that's happening throughout the West Bank, is HR 2590. I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with the bill. It's introduced by Congresswoman Betty McCollum. It has 32 co-sponsors. It's shortened to be called the Palestinian Children and Families Act. It does not restrict U.S. assistance to Israel overall, but would require additional monitoring and reporting on how much U.S. assistance is used in three particular areas. First, annexation of Palestinian land, home demolitions, and human rights abuses against Palestinian children within Israeli military detention, excuse me. So this bill is the sort of best bill we have now that is the most comprehensive as it relates to Palestinian human rights and US accountability as to how our funds are being used. It has 32 co-sponsors. It has been a while now since a new member has joined. But if your member has signed one of those letters that I mentioned earlier, and again, I'll try to get the links as soon as I can after I speak, it's an opportunity to follow up, to thank them for that, and then to ask them, you've showed concern about this through signing the letter, things are not getting better, please consider adding your name to this legislation. And again, August is a really good time to do it when they're home and have events and other ways that they're accessible to their constituents. This bill does not have a Senate companion, is what we say. So there's not a Senate version of the bill. So even if your House member has signed on, you can still lobby and advocate on this bill by asking your senator, one of your senators, both of your senators, to consider introducing similar legislation in the Senate. So would just encourage that, again, even if your House member is supportive of HR 2590, there's still a way that you can engage on this issue. There's currently no, like I said, legislation that would restrict or reduce assistance. The McCollum legislation just seeks to ensure that assistance isn't used for those purposes. But if we're thinking about legislation that might take it a step further, that might really focus on how, even with HR 2590, even with all of these letters, we've seen, even more home demolitions and more annexation, that would probably be what would go beyond what we currently have. But as I said, there's no office that has to date introduced legislation that would do that. There are a couple of other resolutions that are still active that your member could support. So again, if your member is supportive of HR 2590 and you want to meet with a House office, there are two other resolutions. One that was introduced by Rashida Tlaib on May 16th. It's HRes 1123, and there hopefully should be links in the chat to the congress.gov URL for this legislation, so you can see if your member is supportive of that. This acknowledges the Nakba, the historic dispossession of Palestinians in 1948, and encourages public education about the facts of the Nakba and supports implementation of the rights of Palestinian refugees. And then there's HRes 751, which has 11 co-sponsors. It was introduced by Betty McCollum on October 28th of 2021, and that recognizes the importance of the 6 Palestinian civil society organizations and condemns as a repressive act, quoting from the legislation, Israel's designation of these organizations as terrorist groups. So those are the primary pieces of legislation that are out there. We will expect through the appropriations process there to be funding for hospitals in East Jerusalem, other humanitarian and economic programs in the West Bank, as well as to UNRWA. I'll just say 2 more things before passing it back to you, Pat. There is another part of a piece of legislation that's a bit more moderate than Congresswoman McCollum's legislation, but I did want to at least mention it because your House member might mention it if you try to talk to them about Congresswoman McCollum's legislation, and that's HR 5344. It's the Two-State Solution Act, which has 46 co-sponsors, and it prohibits US assistance for supporting projects outside of the 1967 borders, prohibits defense assistance from being used to annex any territory in the West Bank or Gaza, and requires that goods produced in the West Bank and Gaza be labeled as such. And has other provisions that are seeking to attempt Palestinian institutions. The framing of this legislation is very much, as the name implies, around furthering a Two-State Solution Act. So I know there are a variety of opinions on that. It might not be legislation that you particularly are interested in, but it's important to know that because it does have some more support than Congresswoman McCollum's legislation, as 46 co-sponsors. So your member might mention that if you talk to them about HR 2590. The last thing I'll mention is that there has been another area where there's been a lot of attention, and understandably so, in Congress, is responding to the killing of the Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. There have been 5 congressional letters so far calling for a US-led or an independent and transparent investigation into her killing. This is really significant. All over, there have been 110 plus members that have from both chambers that have spoken out regarding Shireen's killing. So there was one signed by 57 House members, another by 24 senators, a third that was bipartisan. It was signed by Senator Ossoff. I think I saw someone in the chat introduce themselves from Georgia, as well as Senator Romney. So it has one Republican who's publicly spoken out, a fourth, and then 2 that actually came out yesterday. One that was signed by Senators Van Hollen, Murphy, Leahy, and Durbin, all senior members. Many of them are part of the Foreign Relations Committee. And also a 5th one that came out yesterday from Senators Menendez and Booker from New Jersey. That's the Shireen had ties to New Jersey. And so that's significant though, because Senator Menendez is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So for him to be speaking out is pretty significant. There was an amendment to what's called the National Defense Authorization Act to provide accountability and determine whether US assistance was used in the killing of Shireen, as well as to, again, call for a US-led investigation. Unfortunately, it was not ruled in order, and so it will not receive consideration on the House floor, but there is the opportunity that a member could introduce legislation, or in the Senate version of the NDAA, it could also be raised there. I know that was a lot, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions, so I will stop there. But thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kyle. That was very comprehensive. I appreciate it. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about bird dogging. In Iowa, that term came up originally because we were talking to candidates for president of the United States. But that seems that here in Iowa, we're not going to have a chance to do that much anymore, but we still do bird dogging in terms of candidates. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what we all can do, and not just candidates of the United States for president, but also candidates for national office, and where it, if state legislation is sometimes you have things like outlawing of BDS is particularly what's happening in states. So you could also bird dog state candidates. And first of all, the first thing you want to do is to prepare your question ahead of time. And recently I've been when I talk to candidates, I start out by saying, I'm a representative of a large and growing constituency of people who of Iowans, I say, you could say whatever your state is, who are concerned about what's going on in the Middle East. And then I continue on to educate the audience. Now, sometimes you won't have a chance to do that because there won't be time to do it. But most of the time, if they're just candidates, and especially if it's early on, you will have a chance to do that. And so this is the opportunity I use to say, given the recent statements by such human rights organizations as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, designating Israel as an apartheid state, then the question I want to ask the legislator or the candidate to answer, is it time for the US to change policy towards Israel? So these are the kinds of things I want to bring up to the candidate. I want to find out where they stand on Israel-Palestine. I want to be aware of asking them yes, no questions, because that's too easy. It's also one of the things you will find, especially if the candidate doesn't know anything about the Israeli-Palestinian issue or wants to avoid questions about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is that they will often say, well, I believe in the two-state solution. And oftentimes what you want to do then is, if you can get a chance to have a follow-up question, then you'll say something like, can you be more specific? And I recently had a chance to do that, actually, and it worked pretty well. He still, tried to be a little, obfuscate a little bit, but he did specifically talk about, more specifically about issues in the Middle East. So I guess what I forgot to say is, what you need to do in the beginning to select your candidate or whoever is, generally it's important to go onto their website and check where they're going to be. For presidential candidates, it's helpful to go on their, you can get on their websites as well. You can actually, it's actually more helpful to go to the local political committee, because the local group will have information about when they're specifically coming to town. And it's helpful to get on their political email list, and because they'll send out emails when a candidate is coming to town. So that'll be very helpful. You need to think about what you're wearing. One time I remember I was going into a Republican at this. I don't mean to offend anybody who is Republican on this webinar, but we were going into a Republican side, and I'm a Democrat. And I asked my fellow people if I was dressed Republican enough, and they said, no, your colors are too bright. So if you wanna be aware of what group of people you're going into, you want to be aware of how to addressing unobtrusively in order to get your question asked. If, however, this is another thing I want to mention, is that if you're going into a group where you know you're going to get a negative response, you might instead wear something that will specifically state your effort. Either bring in a flag, a Palestinian flag. We've done that before. If you still want to see if you can get a question answered, don't sit near the person who's wearing the bright colored t-shirt or holding the flag. I once, where we were listening to Mrs. Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and they were standing on top. I had a couple of Palestinians with me, and they were standing on chairs holding a Palestinian flag, and I wasn't sitting near them. And I went, and there weren't any questions answered, so I ran to the rope line at the time, because when you have presidential candidates, you always have a rope line involved there. And so I went to the rope line, and the first thing, I tried to get something said when Bill went by, and he didn't respond in any way except to shake my hands and say, thank you for being here. And so I ran to the end of the rope line, and I thought and thought and thought, and I finally realized what might get his attention. And just as he was turning to walk away, I said to him, I know why Yasser Arafat turned you down. And he turned around, and as you can imagine, Bill Clinton put his hands on his hips and said, why? So, and as soon as I said that, all the cameras turned our direction, including a CNN camera. So there are ways to get your candidate's attention. And getting called on, you want to make sure that you sit in your candidate's line of sight. And sometimes that means the front row, but not always. You want to sit up and wave your hand, and so that, it's movement that'll catch their attention. So if you wave your hand around a little bit, you're more likely to get called on. One thing I wanted to mention too is that there will be hecklers, particularly if you're talking to presidential candidates. And the main thing to do is just to ignore the hecklers. You don't want to try talking over them. You don't want to get into an argument with them. I just wait until they're through. And then sometimes the candidate themselves will say, please let her speak, or some such thing, or the staff will usher the heckler out. And then you can continue with your question. And then afterwards, you want to run up and talk to the person afterwards. Sometimes you get a more specific answer if you walk up to them afterwards. Sometimes that's when you get your follow-up question. Oftentimes, if you stand in line, then you get a chance to get them before they're whisked out. However, sometimes, and this is more likely the case with local candidates, if you wait until everybody else is gone, you get a better chance to talk to them before they're whisked away. So that's a good way. These are examples of ways that we have learned to talk to our candidates. And I appreciate everybody here. And now we're going to open it up to questions. Let me see if I can find the questions. All right. One of the things for you here is for Amy and Kyle. I don't know, maybe you or I could answer this question since Amy isn't here. Is it better to meet in person or virtually? What do legislators prefer?
Yeah, I would say pre-pandemic, it was not really in a lot of minds to meet virtually. It was in person. You had to come to DC, or do it in district when the member was there. And obviously a lot has shifted. And so I do think that it's made it a lot more accessible, and members still have very busy schedules. So sometimes the virtual can be easier because, they can join and then leave, or they could take it from, a different location closer to where their next meeting is. So I think it really does depend on each office. I would say, again, not discounting how it's made it more accessible. There is, you do miss things not being in person, right? There's just connection and cues and sitting in an office and seeing, you might see a newspaper that has another issue that, connects to what you're talking about. There are just things that you might be able to do in an in-person meeting that personalizes it a little bit more that you can't do in a virtual meeting. But I'm not sure if there's really one answer, one preference. It's going to depend on the office and the context.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. And one thing I have noticed is that we get a chance to talk to the actual legislator more often. Out here in Iowa, it's harder for us to go up to the hill. So we get a chance to talk to the actual candidate rather than just talking to staff members when we use virtual meetings. And usually it's up to the staff members whether we use a virtual meeting or not. And the next question then, this was also for Amy, but what should we do to follow up after the meeting? And I'll speak to this first and then you can speak to it. One of the things I do is I immediately, when we leave the office, as soon as I get home, I will send a thank you letter to them or email. Usually I do that by email, but you could do it by phone if you wanted to. And I usually do it by email because I often send along more information about a particular issue maybe that they brought up that they didn't have an answer to, or that I wanted to expound upon more and didn't have the time. What do you think, Kyle?
Exactly. I mean, that's what I was going to say, that definitely follow up. An initial thank you is critical. And as you said, Pat, it's a great opportunity. Sometimes you're asked a question by a staffer and you don't know the answer, and that's not a bad thing. Obviously you want to have your facts and know what you're talking about, but you can't know everything. And your role as a constituent isn't necessarily to be the analyst or policy expert in every component of how Congress works and the legislation. So the best thing to do in that situation is to say, I don't know the answer to that. Let me follow up with you. And, I'll put my information in the chat. And Amy, there are folks connected, I'm sure, if you're Methodist or wherever you're coming from, through a national organization that could get you those answers. So that's a great a reason to follow up with a thank you. And I would have that person designated beforehand. It doesn't have to be the person that set up the meeting, but it's good to have those roles established. And it's another way to bring up the ask, right? So you write the thank you and you say, and I really hope that your boss or ex-member decides to co-sponsor the legislation. And then periodically, something that Amy said is that this is a relationship, not a one-off. So you don't want to inundate the staffer. They get a lot of emails and they're busy, but also view follow-up as something that you do more than just right after the meeting. You might want to check in a couple of months later. You might want to, if you see an article or if there's another organization that has commented on the issue that you're talking about, you might want to send that to the staffer. So be mindful of how often you're emailing, but definitely don't view it as a one-time, one and done type thing.
Yeah. What did you mean by be mindful of how many times?
Well, I think, you don't want to necessarily email every week or every couple of weeks, right? Because especially if you meet with a staffer, they're likely not the one that is making the final decisions, right? So if they don't respond to you, it might be because they're, the staffer above them hasn't responded to them yet, or they haven't had the chance to meet with the member yet. So you don't want to necessarily get the reputation of being someone who is following up all of the time, but you do want to be persistent. I'm sure Amy would have mentioned that story that she shared about how consistently there was that group of constituents going to Senator Portman about hunger issues and nutrition, and now he introduced legislation. So you don't want to be meek and not follow up, but make sure time has passed, and be mindful of the fact that they get hundreds of emails, sometimes a day. And so if they don't respond, that's also maybe they missed it. But if something we didn't talk about necessarily in this session, but if you write a letter to the editor, that could be a reason to follow up with the staffer. If your local organization is hosting an event, you might want to just share it with the staffer so that it's another way to get before them. That's what I recommend.
Yeah, and I also wonder if it isn't also helpful to, now I forgot what I was going to say. So I was trying to do two things at once. Okay, so what are the differences? This one's for you, Kyle. What are the differences between connecting with congresspersons as opposed to connecting with members of the executive branch?
Yeah, that's a good question. In general, I would really encourage those of us who are constituents and coming from that grassroots perspective to really focus on connecting with legislators, with members of Congress and their staff. And part of what you could do there is to encourage your member to bring this up with the White House. I just don't think that, by and large, the State Department and the White House, yes, there are petitions that go to them, but unless it's something that gets really widespread, and again, it's not necessarily a one size answer, but they're really not going to respond. They don't feel as much of a need to respond directly to constituents, because the executive branch is a different area. So I would really focus on congressional engagement and ask your members of Congress. That's part of their responsibility, in the separation of powers, for them to be directly engaging with the White House and administration folks. So I think that's probably a better way to go. Otherwise, you're fairly limited to signing petitions, or of course, if there are campaign events for presidential candidates, getting in that way is important. But that's separate. I just have to say, CMEP, we're a 501c3. We don't engage in campaigns. So the executive branch would probably come more in the campaign side of things. That
makes sense. Are there certain senators that are hot in terms of approaching to get a companion Senate bill?
Yeah.
2590.
That's a good question, Paula. I would look at some of so I did put in the link in the chat, links to some of the letters that have gone out regarding Masafer Yatta and the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. I would, senators that have led or signed those letters, I think are definitely on the radar as possibilities, because they've already put themselves out there in some regard on this issue. I've participated in meetings with a couple of different Senate offices. I don't know, if it's best to name them now, because there's no office that we expect to introduce anything, at least imminently. But I would look at those letters and get a sense there from who has consistently signed those letters as senators that you might want to go to.
This question is for me, but I think you could probably answer it too, is what to wear in staff or representative meetings or bird dogging. And if you want to get called on, I suggest wearing what I would call conservative clothing. No graphic t-shirts, for example, just something that's nice, like maybe casual business would be a way to describe it. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. Washington is a pretty conservative town when it comes to dress, at least Capitol Hill is. If you're meeting with staffers and it's recess, then it might be a bit more flexible. But generally, I would, business casual. You don't necessarily have to wear a suit and tie if you're going to an in-person meeting or doing it virtually, but erring on the side of a bit more conservative business would be best. I can't speak as much to the bird dogging, but I would agree with your assessment. And there was a question that came to me personally, so I'll just answer it quickly. And I don't know if there's others, but it was around the killing of Shireen and whether we expected the president to bring up accountability for her killing. I don't know the direct answer to that. There have been some leaks from journalists and reporting that says he will mention her killing in meetings, but I don't believe that he will be meeting with the family. The family did write a letter requesting a meeting with him while he's there. And again, none of this is official from the White House, but from what I've seen reported is that he won't be meeting with them, but they have been invited to a meeting at the White House, I guess, after he returns. So that's all I know at this point.
Okay, here's another one that we can answer quickly. We've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to send it back to Bridget for a second. But do you know whether there are any restrictions on Palestinians entering Tel Aviv? Someone is planning a trip starting September 2nd.
You mean Palestinians that are currently living in the West Bank, or what is that?
I'm not sure. That's all they said.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Palestinian and live in the West Bank or Gaza, then yes, you wouldn't be able to enter Israel proper without a visa, without a permit from the Israeli government. If you're talking about someone who's American of Palestinian descent, that does get back to something that I said with the visa waiver issue, and that Palestinian Americans have and Americans of Arab and Muslim descent have for many years talked about the treatment that they receive and how it's hard for them to be able to get into Israel proper. So yeah, that's all I can really say.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. We thank Amy and Kyle both. This has been a wonderful discussion. We're going to turn it back to Bridget now for a closing, and then we'll have a time where we can still discuss things among us if you'd like to stay on for that. Thanks, Bridget.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers and moderator. This webinar was recorded, and you will be able to find the recording probably about next week, both on UMKR and MFSA's websites and on our YouTube channels. We'll also be sending it out in our newsletters as well. So there'll be multiple ways to engage and rewatch or even share with folks that you think would be interested in engaging with the webinar. Our next UMKR MFSA webinar will be in September, and you'll be getting information about that as the planning continues, and so you'll get details about that soon. Thank you again, and I hope you will join us in September for our next webinar.